Okay, so in this video, we'll be focusing on reasons for Japan's defeat in World War II. As you remember, World War II in the Asia-Pacific region started when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in 7 December 1941, and USA declared war on Japan in 8 December 1941, and eventually Germany joined hands with Japan because of the Tripartite Pact, and that became an extended World War II in the Asia-Pacific region. Okay? So first things first, we need to know about Japan's strength at this point of time. I refer you to page 192 of your textbook. In page 192, you can see the extent of which Japan has extended its empire in Southeast Asia. Okay, so they came down all the way from Japan, passed by Vietnam, Singapore, and Indonesia. So they had conquered almost all of Southeast Asia at this stage. Then the question to us is, why is it that they were defeated? Or rather, how is it that they could be defeated considering the fact that they had so much resources in their possession? So the defeat of Japan occurred on the 15th August 1945. The Japanese Emperor Hirohito announced his country's unconditional surrender to the Allies, and shortly after, in 2nd September 1945, they signed the surrender on top of the US Missouri, okay, their warship. So what we're going to be exploring today is why were they defeated? We can broadly divide it into three main players. The first player we have is USA, the second player is Japan, and the third player are the other allied powers. So what I've done is I've classified your information in the textbook according to players to make things slightly simpler for you. So first up, you have USA, the strengths of USA in terms of its economic power, the fact that they dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as their island hopping strategy. On the other hand, we also have Japan who was to be blamed for their own defeat because of the ineffective defense of overextended Japanese empire. Okay, think back to how Germany overextended themselves because of the war on two fronts, right? Same case, Japan overextended itself in the Southeast Asian region. And last but not least, we have the other allied powers. The allied powers wanted to secure a quick victory in the Asia-Pacific, and they were also inspired by the Allied victory in Europe, which happened in May 1945 when they defeated Germany. Okay, so these are the three players this is how we can categorize our information according to the three main players. So let's first look at the strengths of USA. The economic strength, it was the largest industrial producer in the world at the time. It could easily switch from consumer goods to military production. The unemployed workers were willing to work earnestly, and at the same time they managed to protect their merchant ships. These ships are transporting consumer goods. Okay, so they were able to protect their economy when compared to the Japanese, who had many of their merchant ships bombed. At the same time, something special about the case of USA was the fact that a lot of women were also heavily involved in helping USA's economy. So in USA, with this thing called the Women Ordnance Workers, the WOWs, they helped produce weapons, vehicles, and military supplies. So they were very much engaged in whatever was going on during World War II. On the other hand, at least for the initial stages in Japan, women were encouraged to stay at home. So Japan lost a significant access to manpower because they did not encourage their women to partake in war activities. Then we move on to the other strength of the USA, which is their military and naval strength. Yes, the attack on Pearl Harbor was very devastating for USA. However, 3 aircraft carriers of the US Pacific Fleet were elsewhere during the attack. So they managed to survive the attack on the Pearl Harbor, and this actually would help them in showing Japan they were still very strong. So at the end of the day, although they may have been devastated by the attack, USA's resolve to fight back remained strong, and these can be seen in these three events or these three battles that occurred. So we have the Doolittle Raid on Tokyo, the Battle of the Coral Sea, and Battle of Midway. These two things, the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, have been fairly explained in your textbook, so just go and read it up. I'm going to focus a bit on the Doolittle Raid on Tokyo because it was a bit confusing when I read it. So the Doolittle Raid on Tokyo, or otherwise known as the Tokyo Raid, was really a surprise attack on Tokyo, Nagoya, and Kobe on 18 April 1942. The USA launched long-range bombers from the 3 aircraft carriers that survived during the bombing of Pearl Harbor into Japan. Japanese leaders thought that the USA would not bomb Japan because the long-range bombers would not have enough fuel to fly back home. However, the USA planned to fly over Japan and land the bombers in China instead of flying back to the USA. The Tokyo raid caused negligible material damage to Japan. However, it is very significant because it shows USA's resolve against Japanese threats. It also demonstrated the fact that Japan was still very vulnerable to air attacks and boosted American morale, considering that the Americans were very upset with the bombing of the Pearl Harbor. So, although they may have been devastated by the attack on Pearl Harbor, the USA's resolve to fight back still remained very strong, and these three different battles and raids will show you that USA was still willing to put up a fight, and they also had continued bombings on mainland Japan. Besides the continued bombings on mainland Japan, they also carry out the island hopping strategy by allies. Okay, USA was one of the key players in this island hopping strategy. So let me just briefly tell you what it is about. Okay, the island hopping strategy was a strategy employed by the United States to gain military bases and secure many small islands in the Pacific during World War II. The US troops targeted the islands that were not as strongly defended by the Japanese. They took control of those islands and quickly constructed landing strips and small military bases. They then proceeded to attack other islands from the bases they had established. Slowly, the US Army moved closer to Japan, taking control of many of the surrounding islands. To help you understand what exactly is the island hopping strategy is about, let me bring you through this map. But at the same time, as we are looking at this map, I also want you to focus on page 199 of your textbook. So, if you remember what I said earlier, okay, Japan had extended all the way down to Southeast Asia, so it was along this stretch, and they were already fighting battles in this area. So what the USA and the other allied forces did under the island hopping strategy was to fight in areas where Japan was still not as strong and slowly push them back into Japan. So let me bring you through page 199 of your textbook. Okay, first of all, in August 1942, we have the battle over here, which is the Battle of the Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, following which in 1944 they managed to push them back to the Marianas Islands, the Philippines in 1944, and Iwo Jima and Okinawa in Japan in 1945. So you can see that the Allied forces, through the use of the island hopping strategy, are pushing back Japanese forces into Japan so that they can liberate the Allied prisoners of war in the Southeast Asian region. Okay, moving on. Now that I've roughly told you what the island hopping strategy is about, we have more or less covered USA's role. Okay, but there is one significant other that I want to introduce to you, which is the dropping of the atomic bomb. The dropping of the atomic bomb was to hasten the pace at which Japan would be defeated because of their kamikaze attacks, which were basically suicide missions. But at the same time, it was also a show of power against the Soviets. This is partly of the Cold War rivalry that will occur between the Soviets and the USA. We'll study the Cold War next year, so don't fret too much about it. Okay, but what exactly happened during the dropping of the atomic bomb? They dropped two specific bombs, first of which was in Hiroshima, and that was called the Little Boy. So the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, was dropped in 6 August 1945, and it killed more than 66,000 people. However, Japan was unwilling to surrender, and they later on dropped the Fat Man on Nagasaki on 9 August 1945, and it killed more than 40,000 people. Okay, this would be a huge reason as to why Japan declared unconditional surrender on 15 August 1945. There's a question that many of you brought up during class. Why is it that Hiroshima, which was a less powerful bomb, killed more people than Nagasaki, which was a more powerful bomb? To put it simply, Nagasaki was a less dense area and less populated area, so not as many deaths occurred as when compared to Hiroshima. Okay, so now let's move on to Japan is to be blamed. Okay, this is our second player, right? Japan is to be blamed because of the ineffective defense of overextended Japanese empire. Okay, Japan, as I told you before, it extended all the way down to Southeast Asia. They were not able to control the territories as strongly. The Japanese empire had overstretched itself, and it was difficult for the Japanese forces to maintain and defend the newly occupied Southeast Asian territories. they struggled to keep up with the war effort with its limited funds, resources, and manpower. And at the same time, the island hopping strategy also significantly affected Japan's ability to control the Japanese empire because they had to fight in the Southeast Asian region at the same time as they were trying to control its other territories along the region. Okay? Moving on, we have the Allies who are to be blamed. Okay, the Allies were very motivated to end the war in the Asia-Pacific region, partly because they wanted to liberate the Allied POWs who were suffering atrocious conditions under the Japanese, and at the same time they wanted to minimize Allied losses from the kamikaze attacks. So kamikaze attacks, as I mentioned just slightly earlier, they are basically suicide missions, and it is used to refer to Japanese pilots who deliberately crash their planes on enemy camps or ships knowing that they would be killed. So it is very hard for USA and the other Allied powers to fight against such a form of warfare, considering the fact that the Japanese were willing to die for their country. They also wanted an unconditional surrender by Japan. Okay, this was known as the Potsdam Conference. After the Allied victory in Europe, which happened in the May 1945, the Allies' power wanted Japan to declare unconditional surrender because they did not want something like World War II in Europe happening again. If you remember correctly, okay, Germany was not defeated during World War II, however, it was forced to accept the blame for World War II and at the same time had to accept very harsh conditions under the Treaty of Versailles, and that later would allow Hitler to rise to power. So they did not want something like that happening in Japan again, so they wanted Japan to declare unconditional surrender. Okay, so more or less we have all these different factors coming in explaining the reasons for Japan's defeat in World War II. So this is a broad overview of what we have covered. Your job is to figure out, or rather try and explain, how these factors may have led to the defeat of Japan. So did it strengthen somebody? Did it weaken somebody? These are two keywords you might want to consider when you revise. Okay, strengthen and weaken, encourage, motivate, along those lines. I hope this video has helped you. That is all.